Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Dr. Keller, you've been involved in church leadership for over 25 years. You've been an academic, you've been a professor, you have a doctorate. Why have you decided to write this book now? Why now?
I'm getting old. Because I came to New York City about 20 years ago to start a congregation in the middle of Manhattan where people have lots of questions about God and about faith, I've had to, in a sense, journey through myself to a place where I could believe and move ahead and be a Christian and be a minister. When I came to New York, with a lot of people who were maybe 10, 15, 20 years younger than I had to go through that whole journey again as a pastor with people over and over and over again about their doubts, about faith. I had to get back in their shoes. It was a different generation. It was somewhat, it was a different experience, so that when I was done with it again, as it were, with hundreds of people, I felt that I understood the questions pretty well. I was forced to do so, and then many people said, share this in such a way that people don't have to come to your church in order to get it.
But are you responding in part to the success of books by people like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, which have sold vast numbers?
I actually started the book about 4 years ago. And this was before the phenomenon of the New Atheist books. What I did the last time I revised the book, I felt it was absolutely necessary to make some response. So there are a number of ways in which I interact with them in the book, but it's much more indirect. This is really a journey that I've been through twice with people, through doubt to a more robust faith, and I wanted to share it with people.
Now, the book's called The Reason for God, as we've heard. But isn't that, frankly, a contradiction? How can you possibly say that religious belief is somehow about empirical science, when in fact, most of us understand religious belief to be about faith? Mm-hmm. So how can you call it the reason for God?
I think most people would say that empirical science is under the larger heading of reason. And my whole point in the book is to say that it's very reasonable to believe, and let me put it negatively. I would actually say that it takes as much faith or more to disbelieve in God than to believe. In other words, my point here is, yes, it takes both reason and faith to disbelieve and to believe. And I'm trying to say that it takes as much faith, if not more, to disbelieve in God than to believe. That's the actual thesis of the book.
My question to you, though, is surely it's virtually impossible to test the hypothesis, or a hypothesis, for the existence of God, or the existence in some spiritual state of Jesus Christ. Surely what we're talking about is what you can believe as opposed to what you can prove.
No.
Why not?
It's actually probably impossible to prove anything. For example, you can't prove that your memory works, because you have to rely on your memory in order to even begin talking about it. You can't prove that your cognitive faculties work. You can't prove, there's almost, philosophers will tell you this, there's very few things you can prove. Now, does this throw us back into relativism? No. What it means is you have to, in a chastened way, move ahead and see these different positions that people have, and you have to decide which one's better, knowing you can never absolutely prove one over the other, but knowing some make more sense than others. And that is a choice you have to make. You have to decide which of these various positions about God or non-belief in God make more sense. That's basically a reasonable process.
So what you're saying is that you are taking viewpoints, atheism, agnosticism, Christianity, faith, whatever you want. You're taking viewpoints, and you're saying that each one of those viewpoints requires an element of faith.
Yes, but everyone also requires an element of reason. That is, ultimately, when you decide this makes more sense than that, you are looking for reasons that one makes more sense than another. And yet I'm actually saying that underneath all positions is faith. So instead of saying, I'm rational, you have faith, the fact is that faith and reason is mixed in with every position that you hold. And I'm saying, actually, that Christianity and belief in God makes a great deal of sense. And I would say makes more sense than disbelief. That's the thesis of the book.
Okay, in the book you draw upon the natural order of things. You refer to the regularity of nature, the clue of beauty. Mm-hmm. And you suggest that these things suggest
right.
that there is a creator. I want to suggest to you an alternative, though. Rather than these things pointing us to a creator, isn't it true that the notion of God is simply a projection of our own cultural circumstances? For example, if you were brought up in Pakistan, you might well call yourself a Muslim, as my parents were. If you were brought up in India, you might call yourself a Hindu or a Sikh. Mm-hmm. These are projections out of the natural culture in which people live. In your book, you're saying, well, actually, the creative order of things points at God. I'm suggesting to you that actually God is a projection ourselves from our own cultural circumstances. Isn't that true?
Well, then, no, and here's the reason why. If somebody says to me, if you were born in Madagascar, you wouldn't even be a Christian, which is basically what you just said. Therefore, how can you say that your position has, Christianity has more validity than any other position? But I could turn to the person and say, if you were born in Madagascar, you wouldn't be a religious relativist. That is to say, you wouldn't have the view you are espousing right now if you were born in Madagascar. Does that make the view you are espousing right now wrong? No. In other words, what you propose proves too much, and it reminds me of Peter Berger. Peter Berger, in his book, Sacred Canopy, it might have been Rumor of Angels. In his book, Rumor of Angels, he has a chapter called Relativizing the Relativizers.
Was your book properly proofread?
No.
Okay, keep going.
If I had the book, I know it was properly proofread. Peter Berger says in Relativizing the Relativizers what you actually just said. He said he was one of the founders of the Sociology of Knowledge school. And the Sociology of Knowledge says largely we believe what we believe because of our social plausibility structures. That is, we're surrounded by people who also we admire and we need, and they all believe this, and therefore that makes that belief plausible.
And also there's the transmission of knowledge through generations in a similar social circumstance.
Right. Now here's what he says then. He says once you decide that all beliefs are to a great degree socially constructed, you have to realize that that belief must be not immune to what you just said. That is, that belief must be to a great degree socially constructed. I'm an academic, he was saying. I live in a certain milieu. I've got all kinds of other people that I admire and respect. So he says, as soon as you realize that the idea that all views are relative, it will also be relative, that all views are socially constructed is also socially constructed, we're back to square one. We're chastened. We now know, of course, yes, we've got to be careful. It's hard to find the truth, but the fact is we're back to square one. We still have to decide which of all these competing claims is more reasonable than any other. And so we may not be as haughty now, but we still have to make that decision. And you can't say, because I was raised in a particular culture, that therefore all things are relative. That very view, of course, would be relative, and therefore back to square one.
You'll know the writer Michael Onfray, in his book The Atheist Manifesto, he argues that atheism, and I'm quoting, is not therapy, but restored mental health, meaning that the existence of God is in fact a mental delusion, that it's actually an imagined deity that suits the circumstances in which you were brought up, or I was brought up, or anybody else here. And you're saying, if I understand you correctly, that even that position itself is coloured by the culture in which it's being expressed.
Well, I think Peter Berger would say that that man has to recognize the social support that he's getting for that view. I'd get one of the problems, of course, with with that kind of statement is that if you believe in God, there's a mental defect. What do you have to say to that believer in God? And the answer is, how would I know if I'm mentally defective?
No, but but in all seriousness, the point Michael Onfray is making is that atheism is actually an intellectually and psychologically clearer position to be in, and a healthier position, because you're not projecting some kind of image of God out of your own circumstances into your head, into the heavenly place or wherever you imagine him to be.
Well, let's see. Two responses, and I don't know how adequate everybody will think they are. Paul Vitz, who used to teach at NYU, I believe he's retired now, said, in one of his books, he said, the idea that people need to believe in God, they have a psychological need to believe in God, always works another way, and that is, there surely are people who psychologically need not to believe in God. There's all kinds of reasons why people don't want there to be a God. And Thomas Nagel at NYU wrote a book, he's a great philosopher, he wrote a book called The Last Word, in which he admitted, he says, I don't want there to be a God. He says, I am coming right out of the closet and admitting that though I try my best to be objective, I've got all kinds of personal reasons why I wouldn't want that to be true. And I want to be able to make my own decisions. I don't want to have to submit. And so Paul Vitz's whole point is, anyone who says those who believe in God need to believe psychologically have to be willing to turn the scalpel on themselves and say, surely there could be reasons that you would have psychologically for not wanting it to be true too.
Okay, well that's an individual perspective of faith. Do you believe that there is only one God and that there is only one way to approach that God? If.
I'm speaking as a Christian here. If Jesus Christ is who he says he is, that is, if he is the Son of God from heaven, if he really was bodily raised from the dead, and if he was our original creator, I mean, if all that's true, that's what he says, then of course there'd have to be just one way to God, because our souls would need him, or they would shrivel eternally, just like your body needs food, or it would shrivel. I mean, the fact is, my body needs food, or it will shrivel. That's not narrow-minded to say, that's just the way it is. If Jesus is who he said he is, then our souls would have to get him in order to be eternally full and thrive. And if we don't get him, then we would eternally shrivel. So to say, it seems so narrow to claim that there's only one way to God, to say that actually precludes the possibility that Jesus is who he says he is. I mean, if he is who he says he is, then that's what we have to say. If he's not who he says he is, then of course it's narrow. So basically, you have to sit down and ask yourself the question about the facts of Jesus' life and look at that, and not say, I don't even want to look at Jesus, I don't even want to hear the claims of Christianity because they seem so exclusive.
So where does that leave the millions of Muslims, Sikhs and Jews? Are they sadly and completely deluded?
People who never heard about Jesus, or never really got a hearing about Jesus.
I'm not talking about them, because some of those people have heard about it. I'm talking about the millions of Muslims, Sikhs and Jews who have heard about Jesus. Where does your thesis leave them?
Where they are right now, it means that if there's never any change, they don't get Jesus. If he is who he said he is, then long term they don't have God. If, on the other hand, all I can always say about this is, God gives me, even as a minister with the Scripture, a lot of information on a need-to-know basis. And a need-to-know basis means, here's all I can tell you. Unless you get Jesus Christ, who created you to start with, unless you are reunited with him sometime, there is no eternal future of thriving. It just makes sense. Again, I'm trying to go back to this idea that if he is who he says he is, you've got to have him. If right now a person doesn't have them, then he or she needs to get him. If they die and they've never, if they die and they don't have Jesus Christ, I don't know. In other words, I have a need-to-know basis. This is the only thing I know. You need Jesus. I certainly know that God is wiser than me, more merciful than me. And I do know that when I finally find out how God is dealing with every individual soul, I won't have any questions about it.
Okay, but if this is the only way to God, and if Christians are heading for a place called heaven, does that mean, therefore, by deduction, that millions of Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Jews, all of whom hold their faith with enormous integrity, all of them are heading for hell?
There's a lot of people who were born in Indianapolis, Indiana, and they grew up in First Baptist Church there, who are also headed for a Christless eternity. Every human being chooses an identity. It's either based on the grace of God, or it's basically based on your own performance and your own ability, and therefore on your own self. And if a billion years from now you've put your hope in the grace of God, you will be beautiful and happy. If a billion years from now you base your identity on your own self and your own abilities and your own performance, you'll be miserable. In fact, you can see it even now. Self-centered people are miserable even now, not a billion years from now. So there are plenty of people who are raised Christians. There's plenty of people who were raised in First Baptist Church, but in their hearts have not turned toward the grace of God. People in other religions, unless they find Christ, I don't know any other way, but I also get information on a need-to-know basis. If there's some trapdoor or something like that, I haven't been told about it. But I also don't know. I guess I want to know this. I want to know when a person says, I need to know everything about how God is going to deal with, in all eternity, with all individuals before I can bite down on Christianity. I feel that you actually are maybe projecting your American democratic individualistic understanding of, you really want a president or a governor or a mayor. You don't really want a king. And I can understand that because human beings are flawed, and therefore monarchy was not a very good approach to things. But if you have a perfect God, perfect king, comes and suffers in Jesus Christ, then at a certain point I trust him.
How is your position fair and rational?
Well, look.
How is that just?
I actually don't know that people in other centuries or other cultures were nearly as bothered about this as people in this room. And you're doing a pretty good job of articulating how nervous, upset they feel about this. But this idea that everybody needs to have an equal chance is not something that most people have felt was self-evident. I mean, just because everybody you know feels that way doesn't mean, and that your culture feels that way, doesn't mean you can now come to the Bible and Christian teaching and say, because we Western individualistic people don't like this part of biblical revelation, it can't be true. The fact is, in the Middle East, where people are not nearly as bothered by this idea that some religions are right and some religions are wrong, that's not their problem with Christianity at all.
You mentioned the Bible, and in the book itself, you take a great deal of time to argue for its trustworthiness. And you build your evidence around the evidence of the New Testament, and principally the life of Christ. And you point the reader at witnesses, at the fact that these documents were written very soon after Christ, that they were not mythical legends. And you spend a great deal in the book in that whole area. But I want to ask you, what about the rest of the Bible? Because here's a problem that many people have. You argue in the book, well, look at the witnesses. Well, look at how recently the New Testament letters and Gospels were written. But if I had a witness in court, and that witness told one lie, that witness's testimony throughout those proceedings would be diminished irreparably by the one lie. So what am I supposed to make of Old Testament texts about murder, about dealing with concubines, about this bizarre book of the Revelation where there's horses and scrolls and images? What about all of that? What about those parts of the Bible?
The Gospels are the most accessible thing, and they're the most crucial thing to look at. The reason I talk about the Gospels is because you've really got a lot of evidence that the Gospels reliably convey to us Jesus' life and words. And if you decide, this actually is a very similar line of reasoning from me that I just gave you. If you decide that Jesus is who he said he is, then Jesus himself looks at the rest of the Bible with the greatest respect. Almost every book of the Bible, of the Older Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, is actually quoted by Jesus authoritatively. So you can, if you say, I'm going to read the entire Bible and find anything that's incredible to me, and I'm going to decide whether I accept it or not that way, again, if Jesus is who he said he is, then you have to actually deal with the whole Bible, because Jesus himself took it as authoritatively. If Jesus is not who he said he is, who cares about the rest of the Bible? Because that means the core of it isn't true.
But in your book, you make great effort to argue around the life of Christ.
Yeah.
And you deal with the issue of the authenticity and trustworthiness of the Bible, which is a huge question for all of us. And what I'm asking you is, do you not find that what you say about those passages in the Bible may well be robust, but elsewhere the case is undermined rather badly?
Well, maybe I didn't say this just right.
Maybe I'm thick. Explain it in more simple terms.
Well, maybe you're just being a great interrogator. It's difficult. In fact, actually, nobody really knows how to get at the patriarchs, whether Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did the things they did. What you have with Jesus and the Gospels is it's much more recent. You've got all kinds of evidence of it being having eyewitness accounts, and so the way for me to trust what the Bible says about the patriarchs is: is Jesus who he says he is? If I decide he is, then I take what he says about the patriarchs seriously. And I can't, from my vantage point, do a very good job of saying, oh, there's miraculous elements in the Old Testament, therefore it's no good.
Or murder.
Well, actually, murder is done in the Old Testament, but it's not condoned in the Old Testament. Just because something is in a narrative, it's a little easier to read the epistles, where Paul says, I'm writing to you as a pastor, and you're the church, and I want you to do this, this, and this. Very simple. But for example, in Genesis, let me give you this example. In Genesis, you have all kinds of horrible things happening. You've got, for example, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all have more than one wife, polygamy. So many people read the book of Genesis and they say, this is ridiculous, look at all these contradictions. Here in the Old Testament, it condones polygamy. Robert Alter, who's a great biblical scholar, a Hebrew narrative scholar at Berkeley, I believe. Robert Alter says, anybody who reads the book of Genesis sees all the heroes having multiple wives and thinks, anybody who reads that and thinks that that's condoning polygamy has not learned how to read narrative. Every single person with multiple wives is having an absolutely miserable time. Just read it. And he says,
I've got one wife.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
He also says, if you also read it, you have Abel is the good guy rather than Cain, Isaac rather than Ishmael, Jacob ends up being chosen over Esau, and what you actually have is the law of primogeniture, which is the oldest son gets everything, and the law of polygamy, which is men can take all the wives they want. They're undermined by the book of Genesis. And so generally what people do is they read very, very superficially the Old Testament. They see all these horrible things happening. They say, this is a crock. And the answer is they haven't really learned how to read it.
Okay. I've put to you the issue of the psychological projection, the creation as you refer to it, the very questionable trustworthiness of the Bible. Let's look, and I only have a few more minutes. Let's look at the church. Christopher Hitchens in his book God Is Not Great makes the point that religious faith, as evidenced by ordinary followers, and I quote, is the single strongest proof that there is no God. That actually the behavior of so-called Christians, followers of Christ, has been so reprehensible over the centuries that it in and of itself denies the very existence of this God of love that you talk about in your book. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that?
Well, he's right that it's actually the greatest argument against the truth of Christianity. He's absolutely right. I would say of all the objections, it's the strongest one. However, I am so delighted that some of you were here 2 weeks ago when we did the first part of the Veritas Forum with Andy Delbanco and Mark Lilla. Mark Lilla, who is quite critical of the church, Mark Lilla points out that Christianity has got self-corrective resources in it that are extremely strong. And you see in the Old Testament prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures are always criticizing religion. Jesus is always criticizing the religious leaders and the religion of the day. He sees the moralism, he sees the hypocrisy, he sees the bigotry, he sees the oppression. And Mark Lilla says you can criticize Christianity until you begin to realize that Christianity has self-critical resources way beyond your ability to criticize. And the perfect example of this is Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. looks out at a racist South and he sees to a great degree all these white Christian believers oppressing his people. So what does he say to them? Does he say what Christopher Hitchens says, and that is, let's get less religious. Let's stop going to church. Let's admit the fact that, everything is relative because there really is no God. No. What he actually says is let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, which is Amos. And what he's doing is he's saying what you need is not less religion, but real, true Christianity. And he was very prophetic. And he certainly in no way says that the answer to the injustices that Christian people have done is to abandon their Christianity, but get in touch with the roots of what real Christianity is.
But I guess the problem with that is that when any of us look out, we see a place like Northern Ireland, where for 40 years, Catholics and Protestants systematically murdered each other under the guise of their faith.
Right.
It doesn't get more Christian than that. And then you look at somewhere like the Middle East, where Israelis and Palestinians are killing each other relentlessly, and again, they're divided because of the deity to some extent. Hitchens' argument has merit, doesn't it? That actually, if this thing is really true, why is it so difficult to manifest itself in any functional form? I mean, we talk about evolution and that there are holes in evolution, and yet we're persuaded, many of us, that evolution has some kind of credibility. I'm looking at the church, and I've just given you 2 examples. You'd be hard-pressed to deny that those are pretty appalling examples for so-called religious faith.
Of course, I agreed more with you the first time you said it. That is that the behavior of Christians is it's a great argument against the truth of Christianity. I don't agree with you when you say, look, there's the Protestants and there's the Catholics, and they're killing each other in Northern Ireland, or they have. And you have to say that religion has poisoned that situation. But at the heart of Christianity is a man dying on the cross, and he's praying for his enemies. And when his followers get out their swords, he says, put them away. This is not what I'm about. Now you have to say that Protestants and Catholics that are killing each other in the name of Christ have no idea what Christianity is about. You have to say that. I'm not talking about some abstract theological esoteric. I'm not pulling out some abstract kind of doctrine here on you. I'm talking about something that everybody in the world knows is the heart of Christianity. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. He was saying, if you get even in touch with real Christianity, you can't do this sort of thing. So the answer to violence or injustice in the South, or violence, is not getting rid of Christianity, but getting in touch with what it really is about.
I guess the problem for many critics is how much more time do you need? This is 2008.
Well, there's revivals. In other words, what a revival is that Christianity, even more than other religions, tends to go to seed, especially when it gets in bed with power. Somebody was asking tonight at supper time, they said, why is it that Christianity, unlike Islam, unlike Buddhism, unlike Hinduism, tends to, in a sense, evolve so that the new demographic center is someplace it didn't used to be? Hinduism is still basically Indian, and Buddhism is still basically Asian, and Islam is basically Middle Eastern. But Well, with Christianity was originally, it was Jewish, it was Greek, it was European, North American. Now it's becoming African, Latin American, Asian. That's the average evangelical Christian today is non-Western and non-white. And somebody said, why is that? And I believe it's because Christianity's essential message works best away from power. It works best at the margins, that when Christianity gets into bed with power, the message of the cross gets obscured, and it tends to go to seed. And I think that's what you have with state churches. And therefore, I really think that when Christopher Hitchens actually uses some of those illustrations, he's just not listening. He's tone deaf to what Christianity is all about.
I haven't got any more time to continue. Just one final question.
That's why I kept talking longer and longer. So I've learned, you see, the longer I go, the fewer questions you ask.
That's very true. You're very skilled at it.
I know. Well, it took me a while to figure it out.
Just a final question. I began by referencing your own professional career, and you've taken this issue very, very seriously. You've spent your life, to some extent, committed to it. Are you resolutely convinced today that Christianity is true? Personally, are you?
Yeah, more so than ever. I mean, there's three. I mentioned this in the book, in the introduction. It seems like three things have to come together for you to be convinced that Christianity is true. There's an intellectual, a personal, and a social. When I was a college student and I wasn't sure whether Christianity was true, I had intellectual wrestling to do with all these every culture has a different set of objections to Christianity, utterly different than some other cultures. That's the reason why I was trying to say people getting all upset about how can there just be one way to God. That is not a problem for most cultures, most places, and you really have to realize how ethnocentric you are to make that such a big deal. I mean, just keep that in mind. That was a liberating thing for me to realize. That was an intellectual. Then the personal, you have to see that you need something besides your own power to get through life. You have to start to see your own weakness and your own feet of clay. And then socially, you have to see a group of people who are Christians that you have respect for. And until the intellectual work comes together, the personal need comes together with a community of people that you could imagine yourself being part of who are Christian. Christianity isn't plausible. That's where Peter Berger is right. There's a social aspect to the plausibility of anything, but there has to be a reasonable intellectual aspect, and there has to be a personal resonance. And those three things are stronger than they've ever been in my entire life. I'd be very, very, I believe that I would, my knees would knock, but I'd be very happy to die and take a bullet right here for it.
Well, it's been a great pleasure to ask you these questions. I'm actually interviewing Donald Trump tomorrow, so it's from the sublime to the ridiculous. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Wait, Jonathan, wait. Martin, which one was sublime?
Very much so.
Never know. I'll never know.
You'll never find out.
Never find out.
That'll be the next Veritas Forum. But now, moving on to the next segment. If you have questions with your white cards, please hold them up that we might get them back to our moderators quickly as possible. So as you can see, Mr. Martin Bashir tag teamed off to a very special person who I just met, but I can see the knowledge emanating, that Columbia sense that I get. His name is Dr. David Eisenbach. He's an alumnus of Columbia College, but he teaches courses on media and politics in the history department, but more importantly, he's an author, the Gay Power and American Revolution, the winner of the American Library Association's 2006 Stonewall Honor Award, and but more importantly, he's a thinker. And he represents Columbia University students here. So all the questions that we posed the last Veritas Forums, all the ones that we received by email, he'll be trying to model that Veritas culture that we're trying to create of an open, honest discussion, listening to one another, all moving forward, trying to figure out how to do this thing called life better. So if you would, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Eisenbach.
I did.
Tim, first of all, I just want to thank you and welcome you to Columbia University. I know it's not easy to be questioned about your work by anybody, especially Martin Bashir. So thank you. And I think he deserves a great round of applause for me. For you. Before I get to some of the questions that you've all handed in, and please do, if you have any more questions, find the ushers and get them back to me. I want to ask you a personal question from my own end.
Sure.
I went through 8 years of Catholic school, Sisters of Charity, and I got professional religious education throughout all those 8 years. Then I had 4 years of Jesuit prep school, and at the end of 12 years of religious education, I was an atheist. And then I came to Columbia. The sticking point in all that regarding religion for me was the Holocaust. I looked at that and I said, how is it possible that 6 million people could be exterminated in the course of a war that took 80 million lives and there could be a God? How do you answer that question?
I'm going to push back and ask you, there sounds like there's two motives behind the question. Maybe they're both true for you. They're both very important questions. One is how could European civilization, which is based on Christianity for 1,000 years, produce something like that? Or was it much more general, and that is how in the world could God allow that kind of evil and suffering?
That's the question I want.
The second one.
Yeah, the second one. Much more interesting.
Well, the first one is a terrible question too. I mean, it's a terrible question to answer for a Christian minister. But as a pastor, I have to say that the Holocaust is awful, and yet as a pastor for the last 35 years, I've been sitting in rooms with people, as a pastor, with parents whose little, 2-year-old get run over by a car. I mean, it doesn't seem like a Holocaust, but it's the same kind of misery, the same question. Right. Why in the world would God allow evil and suffering? So I've been through it and through it and through it and through it. The right response to anyone who's actually in the middle of suffering is silence and love and speaking when spoken to. Answers I've given to people over the years when they've asked me. The one is, I actually don't believe it makes it any easier to handle or face suffering by disbelieving in God. And I actually do Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. He says, how do you know that a human deed is unjust, or a law? But he's talking about law, but how do you know a human law or deed is unjust? Only if there's a higher law that says it's unjust. Otherwise, what you've got out there is the strong eat the weak. That's how you and I got here. If there's no God, you and I came here through stronger organisms eating the weak organism, natural selection. That's what life's about. That's utterly natural. Now, deep in our hearts, we feel, no, that's not right. But, the question is why? Now, what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying is, we believe that strong eating the weak is unjust and wrong because there's a higher law. If there was no higher law, he says, how do you even really justify your outrage?
And yet the strong eat the weak every single day.
Yes.
So why doesn't God intervene and say, you know what, you can't kill all those people, stop it?
Well, I said there were two responses. The first response only is that it doesn't make it any easier. I mean, it really doesn't, because now, on what basis am I morally outraged? If strong eating the weak is natural, so what? So they did it. Stronger nations eat weaker nations, stronger individuals. So what's the big deal? What's the problem? I mean, that's fair. I mean, that's not a complete answer, but it's fair to say, yeah, now as an atheist, now how am I dealing with evil and suffering? Now I really have only a visceral reaction to it. I don't even have a real cogent warrant for saying this is absolutely got to stop, other than I don't like it. But the second is, now you were raised, you went to Catholic school. The Christian view of God is very different than the other views of God, because the Christian view of God is that God came into this world and suffered. Now, I have a cat, and my wife and I love our cat, and we actually saw it once. We broke its leg by accident. But we fixed it for only $1,000, which we never in a million years would have thought we would ever do for a cat. But
well, you broke it, so.
we broke the cat.
You're kind of morally obligated.
And it suffered. However, I think it's fair to say, because it doesn't have the same kind of self-consciousness, I would say that a human being suffering is probably at least sort of some kind of higher order. You're more aware of things. There's more agony than a. If God really came to earth in Jesus Christ, and the suffering he went through on the cross voluntarily would have been far beyond my suffering. Now, what does that do? It does not. Even after you believe that God would have come down and become vulnerable to suffering and death, that does not yet give us an answer to the question of what the reason is that God allows evil and suffering. But it does tell us what the reason isn't. It can't be that he doesn't love us, or he wouldn't have come down and gotten involved. It can't be that he doesn't care, or he wouldn't be involved. I don't know what the reason is he hasn't stopped it yet, but it can't be a lack of, it can't be a remoteness, it can't be indifference, or he wouldn't have come and gotten down involved. Now that assumes you believe the gospel. But if you believe the gospel, what it does is it keeps off the idea of indifference and says, I don't know why he hasn't stopped evil and suffering. But whatever the reason is, it can't just be indifference, hardness of heart, or lack of
Well,
heart.
have you thought about it in terms of, the reason?
I mean,
Why didn't he come down and stop the Holocaust?
I don't know. But now,
Right.
at this point, you've got to ask yourself a question. If you can't think of a reason, does that mean there really can't be one? That's the Alvin Plantinga.
Right.
Have you heard the no-seums? Oh, this is good. You'll like this.
Okay. Lay it on me.
All right. Well, now, you're an academic, so you realize philosophers talk like this. Neither of us are really philosophers, but you do know how they talk.
I do indeed.
Okay. He says, if you look into a pup tent and I ask you, do you see any St. Bernards? And if you don't see any St. Bernards, you say, no, I don't see any St. Bernards. Then we can safely conclude there probably are no St. Bernards in the tent, because if there were a St. Bernard in the tent, you'd probably see it. But he said, if you look into a pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? Now, no-see-ums, if you live near the Great Lakes, are little gnats that are so small they come through the screen and bite you anyway. And he says, so if you look into the pup tent and I say, do you see any no-see-ums? And you say, no, I don't see any see-ums. I don't see any no-see-ums. That doesn't mean that there aren't any no-see-ums in there, because if there were, you couldn't see them. And he says, now, when you say, because I can't think of any good reason why God would continue to allow evil and suffering to happen, therefore there can't be one, you're assuming that whatever reasons there would be more like St. Bernards than no-see-ums. Well, why should it be? I mean, he says this is probably cold comfort. Without the gospel of Jesus Christ coming into the earth and coming alongside of us, it's cold comfort. But what he's saying is you can't assume that just because you can't think of a good reason why God hasn't stopped it yet, there can't be any. And then the gospel says, well, whatever that reason would be, it can't be a lack of love.
But if he is not willing, or it, or whatever, is not willing to come down and save innocent people, why should we worship him?
Well, I mean, you're still...
what kind of a good God is that?
But you're still saying he can't be good because I can't think of any good reason why it would happen. And I'm still saying, why would you assume that? I mean, why would you assume that there can't be a good reason?
Because it's reasonable.
If they had just showed up at the door and he hadn't lost them in his mind, he would have just said, oh, hi. But because he had lost them, it was incredible. I wonder if there isn't some way in which, when we get it all back, it will be more wonderful for having been lost. And it's a guess. Just a guess. Anyway.
This question from the audience seems to kind of go along with, or probe what you're saying here. How do we look at the chaotic universe that we live in, full of pain and suffering, and not say, well, look, if this is the one that God gave us, it wouldn't be a God. I mean, where it would just be as chaotic and as full of suffering if there weren't a God as if there is. So, why should we assume that there is, other than the Bible?
Other than, what about the Bible?
The Bible is a book, right?
Yeah.
So, other than that book, what other evidence or what other, support do you have for claiming the existence of God?
Well, now, actually, I was about to say, I think that's true, that the idea that God is a God of love probably comes from the Bible. I mean, whenever I've talked to my Muslim friends, they would say God's merciful, but that's not a big part of their understanding. Buddhism wouldn't say it. Surely, you're right, absolutely right, that when you look out there at the world, do you read the New York Times in the morning and say, do you put it down at the end of it and say, boy, you just can see that God's a God of love? Or do you look at history, you're a historian, and just say, you can just say, no, it's absolutely true. I would have to say, the idea that God is a God of love, if you like that idea, you got it from the Bible, because there's really probably no other source for it. I'm being realistic. And maybe the question wants to press me a little bit more, but you could do what you want.
Another question asked about faith, and by offering a reason for faith, are you in a way undermining the leap of faith, which is the value of faith? That there's something to be said for just saying, forget about the reasoning, forget about the evidence. I believe, period. Don't give me any reasons. I want to hear them.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. No, seriously. No, I mean, basically, all arguments for almost anything are rationally avoidable. I mean, my understanding, and I think an awful lot of philosophers would say the same thing, that almost any line of reasoning about anything is rationally avoidable. So rational people, smart people, can resist almost any line of reasoning. So you can't prove God or Christianity, which means if you decide that Christianity makes more sense than non-belief in God. See, the purpose of the book is to say human rights make more sense if there's a God than if not. That is to say, if there is a God, of course it makes sense that people would have individual rights. If we just are the product of natural selection, you could still believe that, but probably it would make more sense than if people were all made with dignity by a God. Okay. Now, if you decide that Christianity makes more sense, it doesn't mean that you've proved it. And therefore, when it comes right down to it, applying it takes a great deal of faith. Actually, C.S. Lewis uses this great illustration. He says, if you're a woman and you were told by somebody, you're going out on a date with this really great-looking guy, but don't tell him anything at all that you don't want spread all around because he's a gossip. So your friend tells you, you're the woman, your friend says, please, I know from experience, everybody is, okay, I understand. I said, don't tell him anything. But you get out there and you actually start to fall under his spell to a degree, and you remember what your mind says, but you really want to ingratiate yourself, so you tell him a little secret. Next thing you know, a week later it's all over the town. And what he says is it's actually not at all easy, even when you're fairly sure of something being true, of actually living it out. And so even if you come to decide, I think Christianity is true, I think it's more reasonable than any other way of looking at things, it certainly isn't utterly provable, so it takes faith to even hold to it, and it takes an enormous amount of faith to practice it. And therefore, almost everything we believe is a combination of faith and reason, and it doesn't take anything at all away to say Christianity is rational. And if you don't like that illustration, you can turn it around and you're the guy.
Well, what about atheism?
Okay.
You said it takes some faith to be an atheist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain that further?
Yeah. First of all, the first part of the book takes the common objections, and all I'm trying to do in the first part of the book is to say you can't disprove the existence of God. I know that there are a few atheists that say, it is absolutely impossible that God exists, but most atheists realize they can't absolutely flat out disprove the existence of God. Now, if you can't disprove the existence of God, you're in the Pascal wager area. I don't even use Pascal's wager in my book because it's so vilified by atheists, and I understand why, because of the way it's usually put. But here's what Pascal simply says. Pascal says, if you can't prove that there's a God, but you also can't prove that there's no God, then whether you're an atheist or you're a believer in God, you're actually taking your life in your hands. It's a risk. It's an act of faith. In other words, if you can't prove there's no God and you decide to live as if there's no God, it's a risk to say he isn't when he might be. And if, on the other hand, you decide to believe in God and say he is when he's not, that's a risk. That could be a kind of...
Right, but then that's just playing the odds, right?
Well, I mean
there's got to be more than faith and believing in something other than playing the odds.
See, I think the way Pascal's wager is usually put out there is, you better believe in God because you have so much to lose. I don't know whether Pascal wanted to say that. All I know is the power of it is to say both doubt and faith are really acts of faith. See, to disbelieve in God, it's a risk, it's an act of faith because you can't prove there's no God. You're living as if he's not there. You're kind of hoping he isn't. And therefore, you're in a sense taking your life into your hands. But I, as a believer, I'm also taking my life into my hands. And therefore, to say you have faith and you have, the atheist has reason and Christians have faith isn't true.
Sort of switch gears a bit. I wrote a book about the gay rights movement because I was appalled by the oppression and the discrimination against homosexuals in my America. Mm-hmm. And this questioner asks, what do so many of the churches have against homosexuals? And what about your church's approach to homosexuality? Is it a sin? Are they going to hell?
Let's talk about my church first, which will be a little easier than try to answer for all the other churches of the world. But I'll try. I mean, I'm representing all the churches of the world, all right?
But Christianity, I mean...
Yeah, I know. Well, let's start with mine.
You go to the Bible quite often, and there are many evangelicals who will say it is listed as a sin in the Bible,
right.
And these people are going to hell.
Right. Now, let's talk about my church again. Let's go back here. What we would say is, I think it's unavoidable. I think most Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox Christians over the years have said, you read the Bible, and the Bible has reservations. The Bible says homosexuality is not God's original design for sexuality. Okay, there you have it. The Bible also says love your neighbor. The Bible also, in fact, the Good Samaritan parable, which is how Jesus tells us to love our neighbor, you put a Jew and a Samaritan there. So what Jesus is trying to say is everybody is your neighbor. Gay people are your neighbors. People who are of other faiths are your neighbors. People of other races are your neighbors. And it's the job of a Christian to do what Jesus did on the cross, which was to give himself for people who were opposing him, and people who were didn't believe in him even. And so a Christian is supposed to say, I serve the needs and interests of all of my neighbors in the city, whether gay or straight, whether they're Hindu or Muslim. I mean, Hindus, for example, don't believe in the Trinity. It's a different view than what the Bible says. Gay people have a different view of sexuality than generally what you see in the New Testament. I'm supposed to love my neighbors. So what I don't see is, at this point, I see some churches that are basically ignoring the places in the Bible that talk about homosexuality in order to love their gay neighbor. And I see other Christian churches taking very seriously what the Bible says about homosexuality, but in a very self-righteous way. So they actually do single out gay people. I mean, there are a number of conservative churches that will love their Hindu neighbors and will love their Muslim neighbors and not their gay neighbors. And I really don't think there is any excuse for that. So therefore, I have to take some responsibility of being a member of the Christian church for the oppression of homosexuals.
Are committing sexual acts a sin against God?
What do you mean by sin? The answer is yes.
Yes.
Now here's the problem with that. No, you don't go to hell for being homosexual.
But committing homosexual acts will get you to go to hell?
No, wait a minute, wait.
Right. No, because some people will say, well, it's not the homosexuality or being gay, it's doing gay stuff. That's the problem.
No. First of all, heterosexuality does not get you to heaven. I happen to know this. Right. So how in the world could homosexuality send you to hell? And actually, the Bible. Listen, this is true. Jesus talks about greed 10 times more than he talks about adultery, for example. Now, one of the problems Christians have here is partly, let's be nice to Christians. You know when you're committing adultery. I mean, you don't say, oh, you're not my wife. I mean, you know you're committing adultery. But almost nobody knows when they're greedy. I mean, nobody thinks they're greedy, because everybody is comparing yourself to other people, and so it's a frog in the kettle kind of thing. However, the fact of the matter is the Bible is much harder on greed and materialism, and it's a horrible sin, terrible sin. Well, will greed send you to hell? No. What sends you to hell is self-righteousness, thinking that you can be your own Savior and Lord. What sends you to heaven is getting a connection with Christ because you realize you're a sinner and you need intervention from outside. That's why it's very misleading actually to say homosexuality is a sin, because most people, yes, of course homosexuality is a sin, because greed is a sin, because all kinds of things are sins. But what most Christians mean when they say that, and certainly what non-Christians think they hear when they hear that, is if you're gay, you're going to hell for being gay. It's just not true. Absolutely not true.
So then how is homosexuality a sin? I'm not...
Well, greed's a sin. In other words, doesn't help human flourishing. Basically, Christianity has an account of what we think human beings were built to do and what will therefore help human flourishing. So we would say if you spend all your money on yourself, that's bad, not only for your own soul, but for everybody else's. We would say homosexuality is not the original design for sexuality, therefore it's not good for human flourishing. We want people to do things that are good for human flourishing, but that's not what sends you to heaven or hell. Now maybe we ought to talk about that. What sends you to heaven or hell really has to do with your faith in the gospel, which is that you can't be your own Savior through your performance and your good works. Now here I'm coming at this like a Protestant now. Everybody's got to be a particular kind of Christian, and there's difference of opinion within Christianity about this. But no, being gay doesn't send you to hell, and sin doesn't send you to hell like that. Mm-hmm. The sin underneath the sin is, I am my own Savior and my Lord. And that's the reason why Phariseeism, moralism, Bible-believing people who are proud and think God's going to take them to heaven because they're good, that's sending them to hell. I mean, I know this is a lot to take in at once.
It's a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I want to get back.
But inside our church,
right.
there's just not going to be this disdain of homosexuals. It just can't be, not when I'm teaching the gospel like that.
Right. But they have to go through the gospel in order to get to heaven. So Jews...
Yeah. Well, yeah, now we're back to where Martin was.
Right. Well, there are a number of questions.
And I know Martin, he's roasting me, so you go ahead.
Well, there were a number of questions here with people who were extremely bothered. And I think it's a very brave thing for you to say, especially in kind of a multicultural community, right, where we're supposed to respect everybody and no one's going to hell just because they happen to be Jewish or not Christian or not following the Gospels.
Okay.
But I think you need to, or just based on the questions here,
let's talk about that.
Is that really fair? I mean, it's especially people who don't have access to the Gospels, who don't even reject it. They just don't get access to it. But even those who do get access to it, is it fair to say they're going to hell?
The people who don't have access to it, I tried to say, I don't know.
Right.
All right? Okay. That's fine. But I would say two things. This might help. Everybody's exclusive. See, there's an illusion in the West that if you say all the different religions are kind of equally good or equally valid for you, that's open-minded.
Right.
The trouble is that's one particular way of looking at religions. And what you're saying, when somebody says to me, don't tell me your religion's superior to this other religion, what you're saying is your view of religions is superior to my view of religions, which comes down to the same thing. Because, in other words, you have a take on spiritual reality, and I have a take on spiritual reality. Your take is the world would be a better place if we believed all religions were okay. I believe that the world would be better if everybody believed my take on spiritual reality, so who's really more exclusive? In other words, each person says, I've got to take on spiritual reality, it's better than yours, the world would be a better place if everybody believed it. You're evangelizing me, I'm evangelizing you. You're trying to convert me, I'm trying to convert you. Everybody is equally exclusive. Everybody's narrow. Here's what really makes you open-minded. How do you treat people with the other view? See, in other words, if you look at me as unenlightened and primitive, then you're being narrow-minded.
But presumably God's making these judgments. So what kind of a God would say, okay, you Jewish people, you got it wrong, right? You're not coming into heaven.
Well, actually,
see how that would be kind of a problem for a lot of people?
Yeah, of course, because it's not by being Jewish. I mean, again,
It's by not following the gospel.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right. But even there, well, look, C.S. Lewis in his book on, and actually even George MacDonald, who was sort of a kind of a mentor of Lewis, believed that everybody in their soul is moving toward a decentered self with God in the middle, or a centered self with yourself in the middle. You can see in this life people who are very self-centered. And by the way, see, what's interesting to me is I see Christians who are self-centered, believing Christians who believe all my doctrines are self-centered. I see a guy like you, even though I've only known you for a couple hours now, who have don't have a self-centered life at this point, from what I can tell. There's a graciousness, there's an other orientation.
Sure, there are other people who would disagree,
Okay.
but, you know.
Well, I mean, I've only 2 hours, 3 more hours would be different. What Lewis is trying to say is if we live forever, this process is going to take you to heaven and hell. 1 billion years from now, a person who is getting God in the center and taking yourself out of the center is going to be an angel. A person who is living for him or herself is going to be a devil. How that happens, as far as I know, the only way I know that happens is the gospel. And not just being a Christian, saying I'm going to be living a good life and, obey the 10 Commandments and do like Christ. That produces Pharisees and self-centered people. So it's complicated, but nevertheless, I think what has to be, just before you go away from this, chapter 1 in the book, if you can get it, is everybody is exclusive. People who say all religions are the same. Oh, let me use this illustration because my wife is going to kill me if I don't.
Okay.
And she's here tonight. Okay. I mean, she will just criticize me, actually.
Right.
The traditional understanding of religions in the West is the blind man and the elephant. Here's an elephant. Here's 6 blind men. Everyone's holding on to part of the elephant and describing the part they have as if it's the whole elephant. So, one man is holding the trunk saying, oh, elephants are like snakes. One man is holding, the leg saying the elephants are like a tree stump. And so the idea is every religion sees part of the spiritual reality, but no religion sees all of it. And every religion is narrow-minded because it tends to say, I can see the whole thing. And this illustration, and Leslie Newbigin, who was a British theologian, says the trouble with this illustration is the only way you could know that all religions are equally good, but none of them have the whole truth, the only way you could know that no blind man has the whole elephant is if you think you see the whole elephant. In other words, the illustration doesn't work unless you believe that. And Newbigin points out, if you really think that there's no one religion is superior to any other, and no one religion actually gets you to God better than any other, you are achieving the superior knowledge that you just said no religion can have. And therefore, it's impossible for you to really be inclusive. Nobody's inclusive. Everybody thinks I've got to take on spiritual reality that's better than everybody else's. And you would say, oh, but you don't think I don't think you're going to hell. You think I'm going to hell. And I just think the consequences of your mistake are more eternal than you think the consequences of my mistake are. But that doesn't make me more narrow-minded than you. Okay?
All right.
I mean, it's just...
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you...
Yeah, I mean, look...
No, it's just simply...
What did I say? Yeah, no, I get it.
You do?
Yeah. I disagree, but I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
but
I know.
That's what the whole point of this thing is about.
It's really, absolutely.
Let's talk about politics.
You're very good to me.
How does your faith, your specific faith, shape your political approach to this coming election? Are you in favor of, a kind of Christian justice, more oriented
Big question.
Politician, like the example of the question was Obama, or an evangelical, conservative, more kind of conservative hardline like Mike Huckabee?
Yeah, I'll tell you my practice at my church again. And that is, at our church, I never even indirectly endorse a candidate. We don't use either code words or rhetoric that would make say Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, or liberals feel ill at ease there. I'm registered to vote, and I just vote, and I'm not telling you, and not only that, I don't tell anybody in my church, and here's the reason why. I really don't think a party can capture Christianity. I've been saying for 30 years that if the Christian faith gets too identified with a party, it reduces Christianity to a political position. And I also know that actually when I read my Bible, I see a breadth of concerns, a sort of a spectrum of concerns, and I don't see one party having the cornering the market on them. So what we do at our church is we try to say, don't be political. I'm not saying that. But we want Democrats and Republicans to feel welcome and to be there and to feel like, they can, be part of the community. We talk about direct action on issues, like say, go after poverty in this neighborhood, go after education problems in this borough, go after environmental problems. As a church, let's do it, and let's get deep into the Christian text, and let's be shaped by the gospel, and then go out and vote the way your conscience takes you. So
where is your
really
conscience
careful.
taking you in this?
But you see, now, I'm seriously, it's actually very important for me not to tell my folks how I vote.
No, but what about these folks? No?
You know what? They're going to tell my folks.
Okay.
No, seriously.
Yes, that's fair enough. I understand.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing. I'm not trying to knock anybody, and I'm not trying to knock anyone at all, but I think it's a very bad idea for a Christian church to get too identified with a candidate or a party.
Well, what do you think about that? I mean, there clearly was a move on the part of many Christian churches to become huge in the American political dialogue out of firm belief.
Right.
They needed to, whether it was save innocent life, whether it was pro-life, or judgments against homosexuality, gay marriage.
Right.
What about that? Standing up against what they see as being evil.
Well, okay, go ahead. The trouble is that there's more than one issue. To me, I'll come right out and say that one of the scandals is that for the last 20 years, African American Christians and white evangelicals, if you actually sit them down, ask them 50 questions about their positions, you'll be amazed at how similar they are in their basic beliefs, theological beliefs. Yet, for the last 20 years, Democrats could not win any elections without black Christians, and Republicans could not win elections without white Christians. What's up with that? I mean, I'm not even sure I know the answer. I'm not trying to say, and that means, all I know is that when you actually get black and white Christians together, their experience, the experience is black Christians know that it's not a safe country, and they believe that the Democrats realize that. And yet they also actually have some concerns that we would bring them more in line with Republicans, but they're not going to go there. A lot of white Christians who are Republicans just don't seem to know what it's like not to be white and fairly privileged. And so I mean, honestly, if everybody sat down and talked about it, I really think that everybody would realize you really shouldn't be in the back pocket of any, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't be in the back pocket of any particular party year after year after year after year, that you ought to look at candidates, you ought to look at issues, and you ought to be, doesn't mean you, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't be part of a party. I mean, you have to be registered to be a part of a party. I'm registered to vote.
Well, they would say, we're not in anybody's back pocket. We're running the Republican Party, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said. I mean, clearly immense political power there. Is that right?
Well, but listen, I hate to say this, to put it this way, most evangelical Christians in the world are non-white and non-Western. And increasingly, evangelical Christians under the age of 40, I mean, you go to my church, on the age of 40, almost any of the evangelical churches in the city, depending how you want to define evangelical, I'm glad you haven't asked me that, they're multi-ethnic, they're not white. They're not all white. And so I think what's going to happen is there actually is going to be, it's going to get more and more difficult for either Democrats or Republicans to kind of count on Christians by their race the way they used to be able to. So, no, I haven't at all been happy with how easily we have, the various Christian groups have gotten in line with parties. I wish they'd been more independent and so forth. So I'm trying, though, to avoid, bashing fellow ministers right now. So
Right.
that's why I'm kind of dancing a two-step here.
I hear you.
Okay.
All right. So a minister like Mike Huckabee, in terms of,
For example,
what about a minister who sees getting into the political fray as being part of his Christian responsibility?
honest, and I know you're going to think I'm weaseling out. Because I'm in New York City, I spent all my time actually studying Hillary and Obama. And I mean, 2 weeks ago, Mark Lilla and Andy Delbanco kind of ranted a bit, rightly probably, about something that Mike Huckabee said about bringing the Constitution more into line with the Word of God, and I hadn't even heard the speech. So I just felt like, here I am, a minister, I should know this, and I don't.
Right.
So, and I'm still trying to avoid bashing another minister right now.
No.
But it's also true that I'm actually on the ignorant side of exactly what his positions are. I do know that I've heard a number of conservative pundits criticize Huckabee for kind of not being a straight line conservative. That he's more populist, he's not a radical tax cutter. I kind of got the impression, what little I've read of Huckabee, is that he actually might be in some interesting ways a harbinger of the future. That I'm not sure he actually fits. A lot of conservative Republicans don't like Huckabee.
Right.
So I'm not sure that in the future there is going to be people lining up quite the same way.
Fair enough.
I'm trying. I'm trying to be honest and also not criticize fellow, men and women,
Right.
Evangelical Christians. So,
a lot of the questions are troubled by the question of how you get to heaven. One of the questions asks, is it fair that somebody could be saved at the 11th hour with an 11th hour conversion
Yes.
or
Yes.
some sort of reconciliation
Right.
after living a life of sin?
yeah, but see now that. Yeah, there's a whole parable about that. There's one of Jesus' parables about calling. It was about a guy who owned a field, and he called. This is pretty in your face now. Are you ready for this? Where Jesus says there's a man who owned a field, and he called a man in to come in and reap from the field at 3 o'clock. Then he called another man in at 5 o'clock, then he called another man in at 7 o'clock, and when the sun went down at 9 o'clock, he brought all three in and he paid them the same wage. And, of course, the guys who had come there earlier protested, and Jesus turns around to everybody and says, when the day is done, it's all of grace. A person who is resentful that salvation can be by sheer grace probably has a little bit of Phariseeism in him, I'm sorry, or her. There's a part of my heart that says, I don't want sheer grace, I don't want bleeding charity, I feel like I've worked pretty hard for this, and I feel like God owes me. And there's nothing that can make you more self-righteous, more bigoted, more oppressive than that kind of pride. And the gospel is supposed to be taking that out. On the other hand, it's hard. It doesn't go down easily at first.
Right. This question asks, why were we made capable or even inclined to sin in the first place? If the mission is to get to heaven, why not just be made good?
I will freely grant that the answer I'm about to give you only goes about 50% of the way. And after, maybe by the time I get to be about 80, I've gotten it to 70, but this is as far as I can get. And that is the old free will thing. The old free will idea is God makes us humans. It's not easy to define humanity. It's not easy to define a human being, but the idea of my having a choice is pretty important. In fact, at dinner, actually, we talked about this. Christianity doesn't work very well in coercive environments where everybody's got to be a Christian. Christianity seems to take a conversion. It seems to take a heart commitment. And the fact is that basically it put us in a situation where we were capable of not choosing him. And it could be that the only way we would be capable of loving him or each other is if we were also given the concomitant ability to hate and not choose. I mean, I would certainly risk hate in order to have love, and it could be that you can't have one without the other.
And sin and pain without having.
Yeah, that's only. Listen, it's like I'm a pastor first, and therefore over the years when I've sat with suffering people, when I've had my own suffering, I know that only gets you half the way there. That's the reason why I kept going back to the idea of God himself suffering with me.
When you say it only gets you half the way
well,
there.
it's cold comfort to some degree, but it's not unimportant to say, I used it on you. I said, well, now, just because you can't think of good reasons doesn't mean there can't be any. That's a kind of rational thing. It's kind of cold comfort if you're actually suffering, and yet it's good to know. It humbles me a little bit. The idea that without free will, there's no love, and yet in order to have love, you have to have free will, in which case sin. And actually, some time ago, somebody said, how could God have given us this chaotic world? And of course, the biblical answer is that when we decided to turn from God, it unleashed forces of darkness in the world. God didn't make the world with disease in it, or with death in it, or with hate in it, or with poverty in it, but we've unleashed those. They're chaotic forces of disintegration because we've turned away, and that's the biblical reason why the original good creation has gone bad.
Do you mean that literally? Like, was there a fall of man when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit?
I think so. In fact, actually, there's almost scientific proof that everybody on the earth right now did descend from two people. I mean, in other words, we are all descended from two parents. And you know what the scientists who know that call them? Adam and Eve.
Right.
Now, so anyhow.
So there was a Garden of Eden.
Something like that.
Something like that?
Yeah. There had to be, when you read the gospel, when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, very often the same incident is told, and it doesn't contradict, and yet it's so interesting to see what one account leaves out. It's so fascinating. So, gee, if that really happened, if Luke said that happened, why didn't Mark mention it? And the answer is Mark didn't want. So there could be a whole lot of other things that happened back then that we're not told about. It's a need-to-know basis we're given. So I think there was an original place where we turned away from God, and that has been passed down to us.
Well, here's something that's always bugged me. Why did God put that tree in the garden to begin with?
Now, you know what? Finally, you've asked me a question I can really answer well. Because I've been acting like all of my answers are good, but I know that some of them are better than others. No, what's interesting about the tree is there doesn't seem to be any particular reason to forbid it, right? I mean, he says, you can eat all the trees of the garden except this one. And he doesn't tell them why. Now, I had a 10-year-old, one of my middle son. My middle son used to always, he was a very hard person, very hard child to get to obey. And, I would say to him, obey me. I'm your father. I've told you to do this. Just do it because I've told you. You know what he would always say? He would always say, Dad, I'd be happy to obey if you could just make it reasonable. Just tell me why this is helpful for me or the human race or whatever.
Right.
And I would say, if you only obey me when I explain it to you, then you're not obeying me. You're just agreeing with me. And I said, I want you to obey because I'm 45 and you're 10. I know a little more about life than you do, and I don't want to have to explain it to you because I couldn't get it into your 10-year-old brain. All right. So God says, don't eat the tree, no explanation. And I think that's it. The point is, I want you to obey the tree just because you love me. Just because I'm God and you're not. I want you to do something not because it profits you, not because you knew the reason why. I want you to do something just because, I'm Lord and Savior and you're not. Just do it. Just do it because you love me for myself alone. And they didn't. Yeah. And you know what? I don't know all my relationship to Adam and Eve. All I know is that if I was Adam and Eve and they were here answering your questions, I would have done the same thing. In other words, my understanding of my relationship with them is they were my representatives. And what does that mean? What it means is that if I was there, you were there, we would have done the same thing. That there's enough solidarity between me and them. I think that's what the Bible's teaching. That you can't say, well, why am I suffering for what they did? If I was there, I would have done it. I say, yeah, sure, you would have read the Bible. No, it doesn't work that way. So that's my best take on it.
Final question. For a young group of people, many of whom are probably grappling with questions of faith right now. What advice do you have, level of peace that you have?
Boy. Yeah, I know. I don't want you to have thyroid cancer, for example. You know, I'm going to be, I think I mentioned at the end of Martin's last question was kind of personal too, and I mentioned it in the introduction of the book, I try to explain 3 things had to come together for me to, begin to feel that I had a relationship with God, and they were the personal, the intellectual, the personal, the social, but you heard that. So if you're really looking for a kind of how-to or some next steps, I'd go there. But I'll just be more personal than that, was that here I am, just to show you how this faith-doubt thing works. Wouldn't you say that I started writing this book probably about a pretty long time ago. I started developing the material. So did I believe the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Of course, I'm a minister. Did I believe in the bodily resurrection? Sure, I did. Would you say I really believed it? Sure, I really believed it. Does that give you peace? Sure, it gave me peace. Then I had thyroid cancer. And when I was recovering from thyroid cancer, it was about the only time in the last 30 years in which I really was laying in bed without anything to do. And I got a book by the Bishop of Durham named N.T. Wright, who's a world-class Bible scholar, and he'd just written a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And it's 800 pages of very high-level historical scholarship. It's not polemical, and yet it's basically, here's his thesis. There is no historically possible alternate explanation for the birth of the Christian church than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He says there's no other way to explain the data. He says there's no other way that actually fits with what we know about first century history. So it's really high level. And 800 pages, and I'm a fast reader, but it was like, 3 or 4 weeks of just reading every day. And I'm reading through this basically saying it really happened, it really happened, it really happened, it really happened. And at the end of 4 weeks, I put it down. I was just getting over thyroid cancer, and I wasn't sure whether I was getting over thyroid cancer, like all cancer people, survivors or patients. And I sat it and I said, oh my gosh, it really did happen. Oh my gosh, it really happened. And what happened, I felt, and you don't have any real control over this, I felt the certainty go down 3 more floors in my heart I didn't even know were there. I thought I was at the basement. Mm-hmm. And there were 4 or 5 more floors of things. And I just went, suddenly all the floors collapsed, or when something happened in the elevator. This metaphor is a mess, isn't it?
It doesn't sound very good.
No, but suddenly it just sunk down all the way, well, maybe all the way to the bottom. Maybe there's further to go. I would have thought.
So you didn't realize how conflicted you were until you became less conflicted. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's true. I think and the fact is that there's probably greater levels.
And you were how old at this time?
Oh, it was only about 6 years ago.
6 years ago.
Wait, excuse me. I now know where my wife.
And you're a minister all that time.
I now know where my wife is sitting.
Exactly. And you're a minister all that time, and you still had doubts that you didn't even know you had until that moment.
Well, yes, of course, because your faith is. See, faith, reason, and doubt are mixed up, right. And I feel more reason. I feel it's more reasonable. And yet at the same time, because I have more reasons to believe, because after reading that book, right. I got more faith, because it takes faith. It's not just knowledge. And were there doubts there? Yeah. And there still are. So more peace than I've ever had, sure. But I've got more to go, I'm sure.
All right. Don't we all? All right, everybody. Thank you very much. And give a round of applause for Tim.
You're amazing.
That's great.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.